again, thank you very much, Dr. Rapave. I think that exemplifies your studies, your research. I neglected to add that Dr. Rapave's studies are from, his doctorate is from Georgetown University in Russian Area Studies and History. And I'm sure he'll, during our Q&A, you can quiz him on some of the things he mentioned, but also some of the publications he has written since his doctorate and since retiring from the Census Bureau in 1998. Our second presenter is Karina Claudel. I've known Karina for a shorter period of time, just for the last couple of years, as we initiated our interest in Lemkos. She has traveled to the region and interviewed many people. She holds a master's in international affairs from University of Pittsburgh, and her area, I think, of conversation today will be conversations with Lemkos. Karina?
Thank you. Before I start my presentation, I just wanted to show you, all right, I better get this right here. I wanted to show you another slide and see if you could guess who this is. It's someone in the room. So I know you know this, Debbie. So it's Dr. Rapawe. He was 12 years old when he was deported from his native village of Karlikiv, now called Karlików, Poland. So on the right, I guess that's your...
That's my passport picture.
Handsome little devil. So, before I get started, just to give you some context, geography. My father is here tonight and can tell you that I'm not the greatest in geography. He taught me how to drive. But so I wanted to show you some maps. This is, I wanted to show you what East Central Europe looked like circa 1930. This is before the onset of World War II. So this is the Second Polish Republic and how it looked before the outbreak of war. This is 1943, the height of the German occupation in East Central Europe, so you can see that that was quite extensive. 1945 shows, this is the end of the war, and these are the new borders. Poland, basically, the borders of Poland, Poland essentially shifted approximately 100 miles northwest, like this. And earlier in his presentation, Dr. Rapawe mentioned the acquired territories. These are territories that Germany lost, and they became compensatory to Poland for the loss of Lviv and some of the regions that are now part of Western Ukraine. So essentially you have a shift of Poland north and west. I guess Silesia and then...
And Silesia and Pomerania.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
And Prussia, the most important, I should say.
Prussia. And this is what the map looks like today. So I just wanted to give you some context. So basically from that you can see that you have within half a century, really, little more than that, within 70 years, you've had tremendous border shifts. And any time, you have border shifts that are so significant, you have ethnic groups that are located in these borderlands, and people tend to equate ethnicity with territory, and so there's a lot of, what he was describing earlier about the partisan warfare, the ethnic tensions between groups. Poland, obviously, was a much larger country and had control of a lot of these territories that are now part of Western Ukraine. And you had settlements of Ukrainians. You also had settlements of Poles in what's now Western Ukraine. So I just wanted to point that out. Go through that. This table is from a 1997 article by Bohdan Kordan. This really just shows the population exchanges between Poland and the Ukrainian SSR. As the result, what initiated it were, as Dr. Rapawe mentioned, the 1944 agreement between Communist Poland and the Soviet Union. So you had something like, you said, 700,000 total by Operation Vistula. Ukrainians were deported from southeast Poland into Ukraine. So that would have encompassed the Lemko population in what's now in southeast Poland, and probably a comparable number of Poles from Ukraine, from Ukrainian SSR. So there's the 700 figure. This is a generally accepted figure. And this is a map that's part of Paul Robert Mogotchi's Historical Atlas of Central Europe. And this, I wanted to show you, give you kind of a context for population exchanges in East Central Europe during, well, in the post-war years after the Second World War. You know, this wasn't something that was limited to Lemkos or even Poles. I mean, the bulk of the people who were transferred during this period were ethnic Germans. So, you know, this, I wanted to point out, this is a major historical process that occurred in the post-war years. This does not count the population of, you know, it doesn't account for populations that no longer existed in these regions, such as Jews, you know, the who perished in the Shoah, or, you know, any other population exchange operations that occurred during the Second World War. Okay, so the legacy of ethnic cleansing in East Central Europe. For the Lemkos, you have the near complete depopulation of Lemkos or Ukrainians from southeast Poland and Poles in western Ukraine. And now keep in mind that these populations had been in place for centuries a lot of times. They had their ancestral villages there, and suddenly, you know, you have such a major shift within a short period, very short period of time. This obviously significantly impacted the ethnographic blueprint of East Central Europe. So you've basically moved everyone around to the tune of 30 million people, around 30 million people after the war, and possibly, you know, when you include the figures from World War II, it gets over 50 million people. So that's quite significant. Lemkos, the thing that's unique about Lemkos in this situation, it was an insular ethnic group in the Carpathian Mountains. So you have the dispersion of these regional minority groups who had been contiguous groups for centuries, but suddenly, you know, they're basically resettled in, you know, Ukraine, and what the Soviets did, and also the Poles, because as Dr. Rapalli mentioned, the first two phases of the deportation operations, Ukrainians were resettled in Soviet Ukraine, and the last deportation and the probably the most comprehensively planned Operation Vistula, the Lemkos, the Ukrainians, were resettled in the acquired territories in Poland. So, you know, they didn't put them all in one place. They kind of scattered them around, a couple families to a village, is what I understand. So, you know, what the effect of this on an ethnic group is that they eventually assimilate into nation states, and it has the effect of marginalizing their, you know, distinctive culture and their way of life because they're no longer together. Also, another thing to point out is a bulk of this evidence and, you know, the archives that allow scholars to really understand what happened has been available mostly in the last 2 decades with the fall of the Soviet Union. So really about 20 years, these archives have been opened so that, you know, scholars can really take a look inside and see what's happened there. Although, you know, I mean, you know, Soviet Union obviously was not going to broadcast this. Okay, so the next part of my presentation, I wanted to let you know that for the last 2 years, actually about 4 years, but mostly in the last 2, I've made a couple of trips to Ukraine, and I've also been talking to Lemkos who have since immigrated to the U.S., so World War II era 80-somethings. And I've been just talking to them about their experience. These are people who were eyewitnesses to the deportation operations. They experienced them and were resettled. So I just picked a couple of my, you know, I call them my participants. But before I get into that, I'm going to just kind of give you you know, some of the common experiences that they told me rather than go into every single person. I've interviewed about over a dozen at this point. But here are some of the common experiences from the deportation and resettlement. Families, essentially when, you know, the Polish army came into the village or the security apparatus, families were forced to collect their belongings and report to nearby rail stations on foot. usually they were only given like a couple of hours to collect their belongings. It wasn't a lot of time, so they just had to grab whatever they could, take some animals, and they had to leave. And many of them, especially in the first two operations, attempted to avoid deportation to the Soviet Union. As Dr. Rapelli mentioned earlier, there were still about 200,000 left by the time, you said about 200,000 left by the time Operation Vistula. So we're talking the first two operations missed 200,000 of them. So that's quite a percentage, 200,000 out of about 700,000. So they managed to hang in there, hide in the forest, try to take shelter and not be deported to Soviet Ukraine. The UPA, of course, helped to disrupt those expulsion operations, as he also mentioned earlier. Entire villages, now while this is going on, the villages are being burned either by Polish soldiers or UPA. This is always a topic of dispute when, people are talking about which village, who burned what, but basically the village got burned down. UPA would often burn villages to prevent Polish from resettling in the Lemko homes, so that was their motivating factor. And the Polish would burn them to prevent the expellees from returning. So they were transported to resettlement locations in these rail cars. So they were together with their belongings, their livestock, everything in one car. Sometimes the rail cars were covered, sometimes they weren't. So they were exposed to the elements. Most of these operations happened like spring and summer, so it wasn't like in the dead of winter in most cases. The trains made several stops for resettling. The Lemkos were dispersed, as I mentioned earlier, not all taken to one place, but rather dispersed in, different villages along the rail route. Only a few families, again, were assigned to any particular village. Each family was assigned a homestead vacated by deported Poles if they were taken to Soviet Ukraine, and if they were taken to the acquired territories in Poland, that would be homes vacated by ethnic Germans. And finally, many of these people were permanently separated from family members due to scattered resettlement, relatives displaced in Germany, etc. A little side note to this story of the deportations is you have to remember that during World War II, there were a significant amount of Lemkos were also taken to be Ostarbeiter, or forced laborers in Nazi Germany. In fact, my own grandparents were taken to Nazi Germany to be forced laborers. So what happens is May of 1945, the European War ends for World War II, and these people are displaced in Germany, in Allied occupied Germany. And the Lemkos really, they're just basically in DP camps, and so from 1945 to 1947, their families left back in the village are being deported to either Soviet Ukraine or Poland. So, this is really how this separation happened and became such a fundamental problem. Okay, so this is the first personal story I wanted to share with you. This is Paisia, and she was born in 1926 in Volia Petrova, a village in the Syanok County area. Her family owned about 25 acres on the edge of Volia Petrova. Volia Petrova was burned in 1946 by Polish soldiers. The residents were transported to Soviet Ukraine. The process took approximately 2 weeks from Paisia's personal experience. She and her family were resettled in the Ternopil Oblast in Soviet Ukraine. She currently lives with family members in Lviv, and she was separated from 4 of her siblings due to forced labor in Germany. And at this moment, 5 of her relatives are in this room. I'm going to be mysterious about that for a minute. Yeah. Okay, this is Anna's story. At least one of her relatives are in the room. I see him right now. She was born in 1923 in the village of Polona. Poles call it Plana. I think I'm saying that right. In 1942, I just wanted to mention she was 4 months pregnant and imprisoned because the Nazis couldn't find her husband. He was a U.S. citizen. And so the fact that, I guess, the U.S., being the enemy to Germany, you know, I guess they were looking for, you had this experience too. His uncles were also U.S. citizens in Kharkiv. She survived the Soviet bombing of Polana in 1944. She avoided 2 deportations in Polana in 1945 and 1946. And finally was deported in 1947 with Operation Vistula and resettled in Gdansk, which is formerly called Danzig when Germany had it. She was 24 years old at the time of the deportation, immigrated to the U.S. in 1949, and currently resides in the Pittsburgh area. Okay, this is not a Lemko. This is an UPA, this is a former UPA. He was born in, his name is Yevgeny, and I interviewed him last June in Ivanichi, Ukraine. He was born in 1926 in the Volyn region, specifically the city of Volodymyr-Volynski. He was from an elite educated family of teachers. In fact, Yevgeny, by age 17, spoke 5 languages, including Latin. His family was massacred in a Soviet purge when he was 17 years old, and that included a 4-year-old niece who was bayoneted to death by the Soviets. That's enough to radicalize somebody, I think. You know, he joined the UPA afterward as a language teacher. So initially he had a job as a young boy as a teacher for UPA. So he was teaching UPA soldiers how to speak German. He became an intelligence operative eventually, and then a Ukrainian interpreter for the SS. So basically he was an intelligence operative, but under the guise of interpreter, he infiltrated an SS unit. So he eyewitnessed certain SS operations during World War II, which you can imagine. He was also an eyewitness to Soviet and Polish operations during the 1945 to 1947 population exchanges. Okay, last but not least, this is a story dear to my heart. This is Maria from Volia Petrova. She was born in 1942. Her parents were taken for forced labor in Nazi Germany, and she was left with her grandparents and her extended family. In 1945, as I mentioned, these things happened. Her parents were displaced in Allied-occupied Germany. In 1946, she was forcibly deported from her village at 4 years old, then resettled in Ternopil Oblast in Ukraine. The Iron Curtain then permanently separated her from her parents and 2 siblings who grew up in the United States. So if you are a fan of Paul Harvey, the rest of the story. So this is the rest of Maria's story. Maria was reunited with her American relatives in 2002 with the help of U.S.-Ukraine Foundation, actually, specifically Ulyana Panchishin. She has been instrumental in helping my family, my father, Stephen, reunite with his sister. He met her for the first time in 2002 with the help of Ulyana and U.S.-Ukraine Foundation. So thank you very much for that. And I'll conclude, and thank you for having us for this discussion. Really appreciate it. So I guess we'll go ahead and open with Q&A, and I will remember to pass the microphone.